Klaus Berger had not thought about George Plank in months. Then Ruth asked him what he remembered most about the morning everything changed, and George was the first thing that came back. He said something at the bar, Klaus said. The night before. Something about the new housing regulations, that they were absurd, that the party had no idea how real people lived. He wasn't angry. He was just talking, the way men talk after 2 beers. Ruth didn't write anything yet. She held her pen, but let him go. I heard the car before I saw it. Early. Still dark outside. Klaus looked at the table between them. 2 men in coats. They didn't knock loudly. That surprised me. I expected something louder. George had opened the door in his undershirt. His wife appeared behind him. One of the men showed something, a document, an insignia. Klaus couldn't tell from across the street. George nodded like a man who already knew arguing was pointless. He went inside, came back with a jacket and shoes. His wife stood in the doorway the whole time and didn't make a sound. They put him in the car, Klaus said. The car left. His wife closed the door. And that was it. The street looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Did you go over? Ruth asked. To check on her? Klaus smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. No. He didn't explain, and she didn't push. The thing people don't understand, he said after a moment, is that it wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was calculation. You told yourself, if I go over there, someone sees me go over there. And then someone wonders why I felt the need. And then you become a question someone is asking. He paused. George had just become a question. You didn't want to be the next one. Ruth wrote something down. Did you ever find out what happened to him? She asked. No. People stopped saying his name. That was how it worked. You disappeared twice. Once when they took you. Again when everyone who knew you decided they didn't. Outside the camp office window, 2 soldiers were crossing the yard. One of them said something, and the other laughed. Klaus watched them for a second, then looked back at Ruth. His wife moved away about 2 months later, he said. I don't know where. Nobody asked. Ruth capped her pen. Same time tomorrow? I'll be here, Klaus said. She gathered her notepad and stood. At the door she paused, not turning around. Thank you, Mr. Berger. Klaus nodded at her back. After she left, he sat for a while in the quiet of the room, listening to the 2 soldiers outside still laughing about whatever it was, easy and unhurried, like men who had never once calculated the cost of a laugh. Klaus washed dishes the way he did everything at the camp, methodically, without waste of motion. Frank had noticed that in the first week and stopped watching him so closely after that. A man who worked like that didn't need supervision. The diner had 8 tables and a counter with 6 stools. Lunch rush meant maybe 30 people over 2 hours. By mid-afternoon it emptied out to coffee drinkers and the occasional farmer who had nowhere better to be. Klaus was drying a stack of plates when the argument started. 2 men at the counter. He'd seen them before. Locals, both of them. The kind who came in 3 times a week and always sat in the same spots. One worked at the hardware store. Klaus didn't know what the other one did. Milligan is a damn fool and always has been, the hardware man said, loud enough that Frank looked up from the register. He won the election, Bill. Doesn't make him less of a fool. Makes the voters fools too. He pointed at his coffee cup and Frank refilled it without being asked. 3 years we've been asking for that road to be repaved. 3 years. My truck has eaten 2 sets of tires on that stretch alone. Write him a letter. I did write him a letter. You know what I got back? A form letter. Signed by his secretary. Didn't even have the decency to pretend he read it. The other man laughed. That's politics, Bill. Always has been. Well, it's a disgrace is what it is. Bill stirred his coffee. Man collects a salary off my taxes and can't be bothered to fix a road. I'd like to see him try driving it in February. They went on like that for a few more minutes. Easy and circular. The way arguments go when neither man actually expects resolution. Then Bill left $1 on the counter and walked out still shaking his head. Klaus set down the plate he was drying. He had heard men complain about the government before. In Hamburg, in lowered voices, in kitchens with the windows closed. Once, at a dinner party, a man had started a sentence about party policy and his own wife had touched his arm, and he had stopped mid-word and changed the subject, and everyone at the table had pretended not to notice. Here Bill had just called an elected official a damn fool to a room full of people. Frank had refilled his coffee. The other man had laughed. And Bill had walked out without looking over his shoulder once. Klaus put the plate on the stack and picked up another one. Frank appeared at the kitchen window. You can take your break. Slow the rest of the afternoon. Klaus nodded, untied his apron, and went to sit at the small table in the back that Frank kept for employees. Someone had left a newspaper there from 2 days ago. He didn't read it. He just sat with his hands around a cup of water and thought about Bill's voice. The volume of it. The complete absence of calculation. Sergeant Holt looked in from the back door. Not checking, just present, the way Holt always was. He'd learned in the first week that Klaus didn't need watching, either. Doing all right? Holt asked. Yes, Klaus said. Holt accepted that and went back to his post near the delivery entrance. He was like that? He asked because it was his job to ask, and when you answered he believed you. Klaus had known men in Hamburg who would have found that suspicious, the ease of it, the straightforwardness. As if a man couldn't possibly mean something else by yes. Ruth came in through the front at 3:15. She wasn't carrying her notepad. She sat at the counter, ordered coffee from Frank, and didn't look toward the back until Frank brought her cup. Then she turned and found Klaus at the employee table and raised her chin slightly. Not a wave, just an acknowledgement. Klaus walked over. Day off, he asked. Half day, she said. Paper goes to print tomorrow. Quiet afternoon. He sat across from her. Frank glanced over once and went back to his crossword. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck rolled past. Someone on the sidewalk called out to someone else. I heard 2 men arguing about the mayor, Klaus said. Ruth smiled into her coffee. That'd be Bill Cutler. He argues about Milligan to anyone who'll listen. Has for 3 years. He wasn't afraid. Ruth looked up. Of what? Klaus thought about how to say it. Of being heard. She watched him for a second. Set her cup down. Were people afraid to be heard back home? She asked. She said it quietly, not journalist quiet, just person quiet. You learned to measure everything, Klaus said. Not what you said. What you said and where you were and who was close enough to listen and what they might do with it. You did that calculation so many times it stopped feeling like calculation. It just felt like thinking. Ruth nodded slowly. Did it ever feel like freedom? She asked. The measuring. Did it ever feel like safety? Klaus considered that longer than she probably expected. For a while, he said. Yes. If you were careful enough, nothing bad happened. And nothing bad happening felt like something. He turned his cup in his hands. Until George. Ruth didn't write anything. She didn't have her notepad. But Klaus noticed that she had gone very still in the way she always went still when something landed. Outside, the 2 teenagers who sold newspapers on the corner were arguing about a baseball score, voices climbing over each other, neither one willing to concede a single point. Neither one calculating anything at all. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Also, I'd love to know which part of the US you're watching from. Let me know in the comments below. The change didn't arrive all at once. That was the part Klaus said people always got wrong when they imagined it from the outside. They pictured a single moment, a door kicked in, a flag raised, and after that everything different. But it wasn't like that. It was more like a winter, he said. You don't notice the cold coming. You just notice one day that you've been wearing your coat for weeks. Ruth had her notepad this time. She wrote that down. When did you first notice? She asked. Klaus thought about it. A man named Dressler. He taught mathematics at the same school as me. We ate lunch together most days. Not because we were close friends, just because our schedules matched and the faculty room had one decent window, and we both liked it. In the spring of 1934, Dressler had made a comment over lunch about a new administrative directive, something about revised history curriculum. The specific details Klaus no longer remembered. The comment wasn't political. It was practical. Something like, this will be difficult to implement with the current textbooks. 3 days later, the principal called Dressler into his office. Someone had reported the comment. Not the sentiment behind it. Just the words, stripped of context, handed to someone who knew what to do with them. Dressler came back from that meeting a quieter man. Not broken. Just recalibrated. After that, Klaus said, lunch was different. We still sat by the same window. But we talked about other things. Football. The weather. His daughter's school play. He paused. Everything that had no weight. Did you know who reported him? Ruth asked. I had a good idea. A colleague. Yes. Ruth waited. The thing is, Klaus said, the man who reported him wasn't cruel. That's what I kept coming back to. He wasn't somebody you'd look at and think, there's a dangerous person. He was ordinary. Friendly, even. He just believed that reporting Dressler was the correct thing to do. That he was being a good citizen. Klaus looked at the wall for a moment. That frightened me more than cruelty would have. Cruelty, you can identify. You can stay away from it. But a man who genuinely thinks he's doing right, there's no way to see him coming. Ruth wrote steadily. Outside, someone drove past with their radio on. A few bars of something bright, and then it faded. Did you pull back after that? She asked. At school. With colleagues. Everyone did. Not dramatically. Just, you became more careful about the window table. Ruth looked up from her notepad. She held the pen still. Klaus, she said. Did you ever report anyone? The room was very quiet. Klaus had known the question was coming. He'd known it since the first session, the way you know a particular stretch of road is ahead even before you can see it. No, he said. Ruth nodded slowly, writing. But, he said. She stopped writing. There was a moment when I could have. A colleague, a woman named Ida Frank. She taught literature. She said something to me in the corridor one afternoon, something about one of the new approved texts. She said it was dishonest. Just that word. Dishonest. Klaus straightened slightly. I didn't report her. But I also didn't respond. I looked at her, and I said nothing, and I walked away. And she never said anything like that to me again. To anyone, as far as I knew. He paused. My silence told her something. Not as loudly as a report would have. But it told her she was alone. That even someone she trusted was not safe. Ruth put her pen down on the notepad. Did you ever speak to her about it? After. She was gone by 1938. I don't know where. He said it the same way he'd said it about George's wife. The flat economy of a man who had run out of ways to be surprised by disappearance. Ruth was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't discomfort. She was just letting the weight of it sit without rushing to fill it. Do you think she understood? She asked. That you weren't choosing against her specifically. That you were just surviving. Klaus said. The word came out without bitterness. Maybe. But I've thought about it enough to know that's not much of a defense. Everyone who didn't resist had a reason. The reasons were even usually true. They just didn't add up to anything good in the end. Ruth picked her pen back up. She wrote for a moment, then stopped. Can I ask you something that's not about Germany? She said. Klaus gestured for her to go ahead. When you first got here. To the camp. What did you expect? He almost smiled. Honestly. Please. I expected it to be like what they told us the enemy was. Cold. Punishing. I expected it to be correct. Ideologically consistent. He looked at his hands on the table. The first week, a guard helped me carry a cot to my barracks because my bunkmate had a bad back and they were switching assignments. He didn't have to do that. It wasn't his job. He just did it. Klaus shook his head slightly. I didn't know what to do with that. Ruth smiled. What did you do? I said thank you. He said sure. And that was the whole thing. She laughed, a short, genuine one. Klaus noticed it was the first time she'd laughed in any of their sessions. It changed the shape of the room slightly. Same time Friday, she asked, gathering her notepad. I worked the morning shift. After two, she said. At the door she paused, the same way she always did, though this time she did turn around. For what it's worth, Ruth said. I think Ida Frank probably already knew. That you weren't going to report her. She just needed to know she wasn't invisible. She held his gaze for a second. You gave her that, at least. Klaus said nothing. But he didn't look away either. After she left he sat for a while with that. The possibility that silence could be two things at once. That the same moment could be a failure and a mercy depending on which direction you measured it from. He hadn't considered that before. He wasn't sure yet whether it helped. The man had been talking since he sat down. Klaus heard him from the kitchen, a voice that filled space without effort, the kind that assumed the room was interested. He was maybe 40, broad through the shoulders, wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He knew Frank. They shook hands when he came in and Frank actually smiled, which Klaus had learned didn't happen often. Tommy ordered the meatloaf and started talking to the man on the stool next to him the way some people read, continuously, without needing much response. Klaus caught pieces of it between the sound of running water. The war. His time in the North Africa. A sergeant he couldn't stand. The particular injustice of being drafted at 26 when he had a business just starting to find its feet. 2 years, Tommy said. 2 years the government decided belonged to them. My partner nearly ran the whole thing into the ground while I wasked hazing Rommel across the desert in the middle of nowhere. He stabbed a piece of meatloaf. You know what they gave me when I got out? A handshake and bus fare. The man next to him made a sympathetic sound. Don't get me wrong, Tommy said. I'd do it again. Every day of it. But I reserve the right to complain about every single one of those days for the rest of my natural life. He pointed his fork at Frank. That's what we fought for, right, Frank? The right to complain about the people who sent us. Frank didn't look up from the grill. You'd complain either way, Tommy. Tommy laughed, loud and unguarded, the laugh of a man with nothing riding on the impression he made. Klaus turned off the tap. He stood at the sink with water dripping from his hands and listened to Tommy Briggs laugh about 2 years the government had taken from him, in a diner, in front of strangers, with a mouth full of meatloaf. He thought about a man he had known in Hamburg, a shopkeeper named Renner who had been given 48 hours to transfer his business to an approved buyer at a price he hadn't set and had no power to negotiate. Renner had come home that evening and sat in his kitchen and said nothing about it to his wife. Not because he didn't want to. Because the walls were thin and the neighbor on the other side had recently joined the party and Renner had done the calculation and the calculation said silence. He thought about Dressler, about the window table and the conversations that had slowly drained of anything real. He thought about George Plank, who had said something careless in a bar and was gone by morning. Tommy Briggs had not done a single calculation in his life. Klaus was almost certain of it. And Tommy Briggs had still shown up. Had still gone to the Pacific and island hopped, and come home, and started complaining again, loudly and happily, like a man who understood that complaining and showing up were not contradictions, but the same thing wearing different clothes. Klaus dried his hands and went back to work. By 2:30 the lunch crowd had cleared out. Tommy was still at the counter, now on pie and a story about a county inspector and a mule that kept outsmarting him at every turn. The man next to him was crying with laughter. Even the woman at the corner table who had been reading her book the entire time looked up and smiled at the punchline without knowing the setup. Frank told Klaus to take his break. Klaus took his cup of water to the back table and sat. Through the pass-through window, he could see Tommy gesturing with his fork, already into the next story. The man next to him had given up eating entirely and just sat there being entertained, which seemed to be exactly what Tommy wanted from the world. Sergeant Holt came in through the back and sat across from Klaus without being asked. He did that occasionally, not to check on anything, just to get off his feet for 10 minutes. Klaus had stopped reading anything into it after the first week. They sat without talking. Holt had a way of making silence feel like a neutral thing rather than a gap that needed filling. Klaus had met very few people in his life with that quality. That man at the counter, Klaus said after a while. Holt glanced through the pass-through. Tommy Briggs. He was complaining about being drafted. Yeah, Tommy does that. He said he'd do it again. Holt nodded. He would. Tommy's not the type to say things he doesn't mean. Just also not the type to let something go without getting his complaints in first. Klaus looked at his water. In Germany, saying what Tommy said, about the government taking 2 years from you, about the handshake and the bus fare, that would have been a serious problem, depending on who heard it. Holt was quiet for a moment. What kind of problem? The kind George Plank had. Holt nodded once. He didn't push further. Didn't offer commentary. Just took the information and let it sit, the way a man does when he understands that some things don't need a response, just acknowledgement. You enlisted? Klaus asked. Yes. Why? Holt considered it. Not performing the consideration, actually thinking. Seemed like the right thing. My brother enlisted first. Then it just seemed obvious. Were you afraid? Sure. Of dying. Of not doing enough, Holt said. Dying I couldn't control. Doing enough I could. Klaus had nothing to say to that. It was one of the most direct things anyone had said to him since he arrived, and it landed with a simplicity that made argument impossible. Holt stood, put his cap back on. Break's about done. Klaus nodded and finished his water. Through the window, he heard Tommy reach the end of the mule story. The whole front of the diner went up at once. The man at the counter, the woman with the book, Frank, a teenager who had come in for a soda, and caught just enough of the ending to get the joke. Tommy looked around at all of them laughing and looked enormously satisfied, like a man who had just completed something important. Klaus washed his cup and put it on the rack. Ruth came in at 3:10. She had her notepad but set it face down on the counter before she even ordered coffee. When Frank nodded toward the back, she came around and sat across from Klaus at the employee table. How was the morning? She asked. A man named Tommy Briggs was here, Klaus said. Ruth smiled before he finished the sentence. What was today's story? A mule. And a county inspector. The Harding County one or the new one? I don't know. The whole diner laughed. That's the Harding County one, she said. It gets better every time he tells it. Details keep appearing. Klaus looked at her. You know him well. Everybody knows Tommy. He's one of those people a town just has. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Complained his way through 2 years in the Pacific and came back and opened a second branch of his business. Does very well, from what I understand. He said he'd do it again. The war. Ruth nodded. He would. How do you know? Because Tommy has 3 younger brothers, she said. If any of them had been in danger, he'd have gone voluntarily, drafted or not. The complaining is separate from the commitment. He just doesn't see any reason to pretend the 2 years were fun. Klaus sat with that. Then he looked at her directly. Can I ask you something? Ruth put her pen down. Go ahead. Why this story? He held her gaze. Your paper covers 3 counties. There's a drought. A local election. A highway half the town doesn't want. Why spend your afternoons talking to a German prisoner about things that happened somewhere else? Ruth was quiet, not caught off guard. More like she'd been expecting the question and was deciding how straight to answer it. Because the people in this town sent their sons to fight something most of them only know by its outline, she said. They know the broad shape. They don't know the detail. Not what it felt like from inside it. Not how ordinary it was. She looked at him steadily. I thought if I could find someone who just lived through it. Not a general, not a party member, just a person who went to work and ate lunch and watched his neighbors disappear, and let him talk in his own words, maybe it would mean something to the people reading it. And if it doesn't? Klaus said. Then I wrote it anyway, she said. That's the job. Klaus nodded slowly. He looked toward the front where Frank was clearing Tommy's spot at the counter. The stool was empty. The plate was gone. The only trace of Tommy Briggs was a generous tip and a coffee ring Frank was already wiping away. He left a good tip, Klaus said. He always does. I think he feels guilty about the complaining. She paused. Even though nobody minds it. Klaus almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that Ruth noticed. She picked up her notepad and stood. At the door she stopped. You asked a fair question, she said. Most people don't. Most people already know the answer they want, Klaus said. Ruth looked at him for a second. Then she wrote something on the top corner of her notepad, tore the corner off, and left it on the table without showing him what it said. He picked it up after she was gone. It said, That's why I'm here. Ruth came back 2 days later. Klaus knew the minute she sat down that this part would be different. She did not open with a question. She did not look at her notes right away. She just sat across from him and waited. You're quiet today, he said. I read the last part twice, she said. Thought I should let that settle before I came back. He nodded. Then she asked, Tell me about your students. Klaus looked at her for a moment, as if checking whether he had heard right. My students, he said. Before everything changed. You taught school. He leaned back slightly. Yes. Tell me what that was like. Klaus looked at the table. The room was quiet except for a chair scraping somewhere near the front. Then he started, but not in the way someone starts a story they have rehearsed. More like a man lifting a box he has not touched in years. I taught literature. German literature. Mostly boys, some girls in the later classes when the rules shifted and the schools changed. 12 to 16, mostly. They came in with ink on their fingers and dirt on their shoes and no patience for verse unless I made it worth their time. Ruth wrote nothing yet. She let him keep going. I liked the clever ones, he said. The ones who argued. If a student disagreed with a reading, I wanted to hear why. Not because I wanted to be challenged for sport. Because if they could explain themselves, they were thinking. That mattered. Did they know you liked that? Some did. He paused, then added, A few took advantage of it. That got a small smile from Ruth. Klaus went on. I had one boy, Martin. 15, maybe 16. He hated poetry. Would read 3 lines and declare the whole thing useless. But he had a good ear for language. He could hear when a sentence was false. Not grammatically false. Morally false. Ruth looked up. What does that mean? It means he knew when someone was speaking carefully to avoid truth. She let that sit. Klaus was staring at his hands again. He once asked me why we studied old books when the country needed young men to be useful. And what did you say? I said usefulness wasn't the same as obedience. He paused. At least, that's what I used to say before I became more careful. Ruth's pen moved. The old answer and the new answer were not the same thing, and both of them seemed to matter to him. Did the students change when the regime changed? She asked. Yes. How? The loud ones got quieter first. The clever ones learned to make their questions sound harmless. The ones who liked to laugh stopped doing it so often in class. He looked up briefly. And then the curriculum changed enough that I had to teach them things I no longer believed were true. Ruth didn't interrupt. They gave us approved texts, approved interpretations, approved terms. The boys were supposed to admire strength, sacrifice, order. The girls were supposed to admire duty, motherhood, all the usual things. He shook his head once. You can teach through lies for a while. The problem is that eventually the lies start teaching you. Did you ever say that out loud? Ruth asked. No. Why not? Because people heard everything by then. And because saying it out loud would have meant choosing a side. I was still telling myself I wasn't ready to do that. Ruth wrote that down. Klaus was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, Do you know what the hardest part was? Tell me. Not the propaganda itself. Not even the books. It was the small things. The way a student would stop asking a question halfway through because he had noticed who else was in the room. The way a girl who used to speak freely would start glancing at the door before answering. Those changes were hard to measure. But they were everywhere. Ruth looked at him steadily. Did you know where that led? He gave a short shake of his head. Not fully. No one wants to know the full version until it's too late. He said it without drama. That made it worse. One of my students disappeared, he said after a moment. Ruth's pen stopped. Her name was Latte. 17. Her father worked at the post office. She was sharp, impatient, always corrected people if they used a word badly. She asked the kind of questions that made older teachers uncomfortable. What happened? Klaus looked past Ruth. Not at her, but at something beyond the room. She asked in class why the newspapers all sounded the same. Not in a rebellious way. Just curiosity. She said, If everyone says the same thing, how do we know it's true? He swallowed once. That was in March. By April she had stopped coming. Ruth stayed still. Did you ask where she went? She said. I asked another teacher. He told me her family had moved. And you believed him? Klaus looked at her. I wanted to. He did not say anything else for a long moment. Then, in a lower voice, months later I saw her mother in a market. I asked about Latte. She looked at me as if I had said something obscene. Then she said, very quietly, You didn't hear? Ruth waited. She had been taken for questioning after a meeting at school. Someone said she had been overheard repeating foreign radio reports. By the time the family understood where she was, it was too late to do anything. What does too late mean? Ruth asked. Klaus's jaw tightened. It means she was gone by the time anyone with enough power was willing to admit she mattered. Ruth wrote that down slowly. Klaus kept talking. There were others like that. A boy named Peter who began wearing his hair differently because he had seen older boys do it and thought it made him look more serious. He was 14. Serious enough to repeat phrases he didn't understand. That happens quickly with children. They learn the shape of the thing before they learn what it costs. Ruth's voice was careful. Did you ever tell them the truth? Sometimes, he said. She looked up. Not the whole truth. Not enough to risk much. But enough, I hope, to leave a mark. I would choose a line from a poem that meant one thing on the surface and another underneath. A student who was listening closely might hear both. Did they? Some did. Did it help? He was quiet again. I don't know, he said. That's the worst answer. I don't know. I tell myself sometimes that a boy who remembers a line at the right moment may still have a chance to think differently. But I also know most of them were being shaped by everything else around them. Ruth put her pen down. Did you believe in the regime? She asked. Klaus answered at once. No. It came too fast to be rehearsed. She held his gaze. He looked back, not defensive, just tired. I believed in staying employed, in not being noticed, in keeping my mother out of trouble, in buying enough food, in getting through the next week. He folded his hands together. I did not believe in what was being done. I told myself there was a difference. And now I think there was a difference. Just not one worth very much. Ruth was quiet. Not because she had nothing to ask, but because she knew there was more coming if she let him continue. And there was. I think about Ida Frank, he said. And Dressler. And Latte. They asked questions. They paid for it. I didn't ask enough. I didn't pay enough. I kept the job. I kept the books on the shelves long enough to see them changed into something else. He looked down at the table. That is not a defense. It's just the truth. Ruth finally wrote something, very fast. What do you want me to understand? She asked. He thought about it. That most of the damage was done by people who did not think they were doing damage. That sounds like an excuse, she said. It is not meant to be. Then what is it meant to be? A warning, he said. For your readers. For the people who think cruelty has to look cruel to be real. That answer stayed in the room. Ruth closed her notebook, but did not stand yet. When she spoke again, her voice had softened. Did you ever have a student who was safe? Klaus almost smiled, but it didn't reach far. Safe is the wrong word. One boy, Emil. He was not brave. Not especially clever. Not loud. He just had a habit of asking one more question than was comfortable. He looked at Ruth. He survived. I saw him once after the war ended. He said he remembered me telling the class that a sentence can be correct and still lie. Ruth waited. Klaus looked at the table and then back up. He said that was the only thing I taught that stayed with him. Ruth was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, I think that matters. Klaus gave a small shrug. Maybe. It does. He did not argue. When Ruth left that day, she did not ask when she should return. She knew. Klaus knew. And after she was gone, he sat in the room for a while longer, thinking about a classroom, a row of boys with ink on their fingers, a girl who wanted to know why all the newspapers sounded the same, and the terrible ease with which a country could teach children to stop asking. Ruth came in on a Thursday, and she did not have her notepad. Klaus noticed immediately. She sat at the counter, ordered coffee from Frank, and when she came around to the back table, she had nothing in her hands except the cup. No notebook today, he said. No notebook, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Is the story finished? The story is finished. She sat down. This is just coffee. Klaus accepted that. Frank brought him a cup without being asked, which he had started doing somewhere around the third week. Small acknowledgments like that had accumulated quietly. The better table near the window, the extra piece of bread with lunch, the way Frank sometimes translated for him with customers before Klaus had a chance to struggle through the English. None of it announced. All of it real. They sat for a moment without talking. Outside, the street was doing what it did on Thursday afternoons. A delivery truck double-parked in front of the hardware store. Two women came out of the post office together, talking without stopping, walking slowly, so the conversation could finish before they had to go separate ways. A boy on a bicycle cut through a gap between parked cars with the absolute confidence of someone who has never considered consequences. When does the story run? Klaus asked. Next week. Friday edition. Ruth turned her cup in her hands. My editor wanted to cut the part about latte. Klaus looked at her. I told him if he cut it the whole piece didn't work. She paused. He kept it. Why did he want to cut it? He said it was too heavy for a Friday paper. That people read the Friday edition at the end of a long week and don't want to feel that. She took a sip of her coffee. I told him that was exactly why it needed to be there. Klaus said nothing. But he heard what she was saying, which was that she had fought for the story, and that the story had won. Will people read it? He asked. Some will. Some will skip past it. Some will read the first paragraph and stop. She set her cup down. The ones who finish it will think about it for a while. And that's enough? Ruth looked at him steadily. That's all a story can do. He nodded once. He understood that. He had spent 11 years in a classroom knowing that most of what you said disappeared the minute students walked out the door. The part that stayed, you couldn't predict it, couldn't force it. You just had to say the true thing clearly and trust that it would find whoever needed it. Sergeant Holt looked in through the back door, saw that Klaus was seated and accounted for, and disappeared again. His footsteps moved back toward the delivery entrance. What happens after the camp? Ruth asked. I go back. To Hamburg. To whatever Hamburg is now. He said it without bitterness. Just the flat acknowledgement of a man who has learned not to assume places stay the same while he is elsewhere. My mother is there. Or was, last I heard. The mail is not reliable. Are you afraid? He thought about it honestly the way he always did. Of what I'll find. Yes. Of going back. No. He looked toward the window. Germany is still where I know how to be. This, he gestured without finishing the sentence, meaning the diner, the town, the two women from the post office and the boy on the bicycle and Tommy Briggs and his North Africa complaints. This is not something I could stay inside of. Not the way you can. Ruth looked at him. Why not? Because you grow up learning the size of a room, he said. And I grew up in a different room. Smaller. With different walls. I can see that yours is larger. I understand it is larger. But understanding is not the same as belonging. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Do you think Germany can change? she asked. I think it has to. That's not the same as yes. No, he said. It's not. He looked at the window again. Two teenagers had appeared on the sidewalk outside, arguing about something with the full intensity of people for whom the argument is the most important thing currently happening in the world. One of them threw his hands up. The other crossed his arms and said something that made the first one stop and think, and then wave his hand and concede the point, and then they both laughed and kept walking. Klaus watched them until they were out of sight. When I was in school, he said, we were not taught to argue. Ruth followed his gaze to the now empty stretch of sidewalk. We were taught to agree. The right way, with the right words, in the right order. He turned back from the window. Argument meant doubt. Doubt meant weakness. Weakness meant you were not fully committed. He picked up his cup. By the time I was teaching, my students had grown up inside that. Some of them had never once argued with an adult and been heard. Ruth picked up her pen from the table, then remembered she had no notepad and put it back down. Old habit. What did that cost them, she asked. The ability to tell the difference, he said. Between what? Between a thing that is true and a thing they have simply heard many times. He set the cup down. If you never argue, you never test. If you never test, you accept. And if you accept long enough, you stop noticing you ever had a choice. Ruth sat with that. Frank appeared at the pass-through window, not looking at them specifically, just making his presence known the way he did when the afternoon stretched into dinner hour and he needed the back table. Klaus saw it and began to stand. 5 more minutes, Ruth told Frank. Frank nodded and went back to the grill without a word. Another small thing. Another real one. They stayed at the table. Can I ask you something? Ruth said. Yes. Do you think the people here understand what they have? Klaus did not answer immediately. He looked around the diner. The counter with its 6 stools. Frank's handwritten daily specials on the chalkboard. The window with the afternoon light coming through it at a flat angle now, the way it did later in the day. The faint sound of the radio Frank kept at low volume behind the counter. No, Klaus said. Not most of them. Ruth looked almost relieved at the honesty. But Tommy Briggs does, he added. She looked at him. Not because he thinks about it, Klaus said. Because he uses it. Every day? Without calculation. He looked toward the front. That's not ignorance. That's something else. Ruth turned and looked at the empty counter stool where Tommy always sat. Then she reached across the table and picked up her pen. She had no notepad. She looked around for something and found the paper napkin under her coffee cup. She smoothed it against the table. Say that again, she said. Which part? The last part. About Tommy. Klaus looked at her for a moment. Then, carefully, the way he used to choose the right line from a poem for a classroom that needed to hear something true. He doesn't know what freedom costs because he has never had to buy it. But he spends it every day, loudly, carelessly, without keeping track. And somehow that is exactly the right way to spend it. Ruth wrote it on the napkin, slowly, like someone writing down something they don't want to get wrong. When she finished, she looked at it for a moment and then folded it once and put it in her coat pocket. That's the ending, she said. Klaus looked at her. Of the story, she said. That's how it ends. He said nothing. He looked out the window at the street where the 2 teenagers had been arguing and laughing 20 minutes ago. The sidewalk was empty now. The delivery truck had gone. The 2 women from the post office were long home. The street looked like any other street at the end of any other afternoon. Klaus thought about George Plank Street. How it had looked exactly the same after the car left. How that sameness had been the most frightening thing about it. That the world could rearrange a man's entire life and still look completely unchanged by morning. This street did not feel like that street. He could not have explained precisely why. It was not the buildings, or the light, or the time of day. It was something underneath the visible thing. Something in the way the boy on the bicycle had cut between the cars without looking over his shoulder. The way the women had kept talking all the way to the corner. The way 2 teenagers could stand on a public sidewalk and argue at full volume about nothing, and have it mean nothing except that they disagreed. All of it ordinary. All of it worth something. Same time next week? Klaus said. Ruth stood, her coat already on, the napkin folded in her pocket. She smiled. I told you. No more story. I know, he said. I meant coffee. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her cup, finished the last of it, and set it back down on the table. After 2, she said. And she walked out through the front, past Frank's counter and the 6 stools and the chalkboard with the daily specials. and out into the street that looked like any other street at the end of any other day. Klaus sat for a while longer. Then he untied his apron, folded it over the back of the chair, and went to help Frank close up.